The morning sun over London was weak, doing little to cut the bitter chill of the December air. Outside the high walls of Windsor Castle, tourists huddled together, their breath forming small clouds as they tried to capture the perfect photograph of the famous guards. Among the crowd, a little girl no older than 7 stood slightly apart from the main group. She wore a bright red coat that made her easy to spot, but her body language told a different story than her cheerful clothing. Her shoulders were hunched forward, and she kept her eyes fixed on the ground, occasionally glancing up at the man beside her who held her hand in a grip that looked too tight to be gentle. The man was tall and broad, dressed in casual clothes that seemed ordinary enough, but there was something wrong about the way he scanned the crowd. And he wasn't looking at the castle or the guards like everyone else. He was watching the people around them, studying faces, counting security cameras, noting the positions of police officers. His eyes never stayed in one place for long, and whenever the little girl tried to slow down or look at something, he would tug her arm sharply and lean down to whisper something in her ear. Her face would go pale, and she would immediately look away. Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale stood in his sentry box outside the castle walls, his bearskin hat making him tower above the visiting school children who had stopped to watch the changing of the guard. His face remained perfectly still, a mask of ceremonial discipline, but his eyes were alive and moving constantly. That was the secret that tourists never understood about the Queen's Guard. And the ones who stood motionless outside the palaces weren't just ceremonial decorations. They were hand-picked soldiers from some of the most elite regiments in the British Army, and while their bodies remained frozen, their training demanded that their minds work overtime. Roderick had served in the infantry for 12 years before being selected for public duties. He had done 2 tours in conflict zones where a moment of inattention could mean death. He knew how to read crowds, how to spot the subtle signs of trouble before it started, and right now, every instinct he had was screaming at him to pay attention to the man in the gray jacket and the little girl in the red coat. The pair had been standing near the barrier for nearly 20 minutes, which was not unusual in itself. Many visitors lingered, waiting for the guards to march or hoping to see a member of the royal family pass through the gates. But this man wasn't behaving like a tourist. He wasn't taking photos. He wasn't pointing out the castle's features to the girl. He was just standing there, holding her hand and watching. Roderick's eyes drifted down to the girl. She was small for her age, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a face that would have been pretty if it hadn't been so expressionless. Most children who came to see the guards were excited. They waved, they made faces, they tried to get the guards to smile or laugh. But this girl stood perfectly still, staring at nothing, her free hand hanging limply at her side. Then she moved her hand. It was a tiny gesture, so small that anyone not trained to notice body language would have missed it completely. And her fingers curled into a loose fist, then extended again. She repeated the movement twice more, her hand hidden from the man beside her by the folds of her coat. Roderick's heart nearly stopped. He knew that signal. He had learned it during a specialized training course on child protection, a course designed to help soldiers and police officers identify children in distress who couldn't speak openly. It was an internationally recognized distress signal taught to children in danger, a way to silently ask for help when an abuser was watching. The girl had just asked him for help. Roderick's training warred with his instincts. The Queen's Guard did not leave their posts. They did not approach members of the public. They did not break the perfect ceremonial stillness that had made them famous around the world. And to do so would be a breach of protocol so serious that it could end his career. He would face disciplinary action, possibly even court-martial. He would bring shame to his regiment. The tourists would film everything, and the videos would go viral, and the world would laugh at the guard who couldn't stand still. But the girl had asked for help. He looked at her again, and this time, she raised her eyes just enough to meet his gaze. For a split second, he saw everything he needed to see. Fear. Desperation. The look of a child who had run out of options and was throwing one last desperate plea to the only person who might possibly save her. The man in the gray jacket noticed that she had stopped walking. He tugged her arm again, harder this time, and her face contorted in pain. He leaned down and whispered something, and she immediately dropped her eyes back to the ground. Roderick made his decision. He stepped out of his sentry box. The crowd gasped. Tourists who had been watching him, waiting for him to move so they could get a video of the famous guard-breaking character, suddenly had their wish fulfilled. But this was not the humorous blink or the playful interaction they had hoped for. Roderick's face was set in an expression of grim determination as he strode directly toward the man and the little girl, his boots clicking sharply against the pavement. The man saw him coming. For a moment he looked confused, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then his expression shifted to something else. Fear. He tightened his grip on the girl's arm and tried to pull her back into the crowd, but Roderick was faster. He stepped directly into their path, his towering height and military bearing cutting off any hope of escape. "Release the child," Roderick said. His voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. The man tried to laugh it off. "She's my daughter. She's fine. We were just leaving." Roderick didn't move. He didn't blink. He kept his eyes fixed on the man's face, watching the sweat begin to form on his forehead, watching his eyes dart left and right, looking for an escape route. "Release the child," he repeated. "Now!" Behind him, Roderick could hear the commotion. Tourists were filming. Other guards were watching, uncertain whether to intervene. A police officer who had been stationed near the gates was already moving toward them, his hand on his radio. But Roderick didn't wait for backup. He couldn't wait. Every second that passed was a second the man could use to hurt the girl or try to run. The man made a final, desperate attempt. He shoved the girl toward Roderick and bolted in the opposite direction, crashing through the crowd and knocking over a woman who had been holding a camera. But he didn't get far. The police officer who had been approaching tackled him to the ground within seconds, and within minutes, there were half a dozen officers surrounding him, handcuffing him, reading him his rights. Roderick barely noticed any of it. He had dropped to one knee in front of the little girl, who stood trembling in the middle of the chaos, her red coat bright against the gray pavement. She was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. But there was something else in her expression, too. Relief. The overwhelming, bone-deep relief of a prisoner who had just been set free. "It's okay," Roderick said softly, his voice completely different from the commanding tone he had used with the man. "You're safe now? No one is going to hurt you?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide and wet. "You saw," she whispered. "You saw my signal." Roderick nodded. "I saw." The police station was chaos for the first few hours. Officers rushed back and forth, taking statements, processing the arrested man, and trying to piece together the full story of what had nearly happened outside Windsor Castle that morning. But in a small, quiet room near the back of the building, two people sat alone, and separated by a table and the vast gulf of experience that lay between a hardened soldier and a traumatized child. The little girl's name was Lily. She was 7 years old, and she had been missing for 11 days. Roderick sat across from her, still in his ceremonial uniform, though he had removed his bearskin hat. It rested on the table between them, and Lily kept staring at it as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. She had stopped crying, but her hands still trembled slightly, and she held a cup of sweet tea that one of the officers had given her without taking a single sip. "I'm sorry I made you leave your spot," Lily said suddenly. Her voice was small and shaky. "The other guards didn't move. I saw them. They just stood there. But you came. I didn't think you would come." Roderick leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Do you know why I came, Lily?" She shook her head. "Because you asked me to," he said. "You were very brave to make that signal, very smart. Not many people know about that signal, and even fewer would have been brave enough to use it when they were so scared. Do you understand how brave that was?" Lily considered this for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had been brought into the station, a tiny flicker of something that might have been pride crossed her face. "My mom taught me," she said, "before she got sick. She said if anyone ever tried to take me away, I should find a safe person and make the signal. She said safe people would know what it means." "Your mum was right," Roderick said. "She sounds like a very smart woman." Lily's face clouded. "She died. Last year. And then I went to live with my dad's friend because my dad couldn't look after me. But the friend wasn't nice. He had other friends who weren't nice either. And then the man who brought me to the castle said we were going on a trip. But I knew we weren't. I knew he was taking me somewhere bad." She didn't elaborate on what "somewhere bad" meant, and Roderick didn't ask. He had seen enough in his years of service to fill in the horrible blanks. Child trafficking, exploitation, a fate so terrible that he couldn't let himself think about it too deeply, or he would never be able to function again. A detective entered the room, her face grave. She nodded at Roderick and then crouched down beside Lily's chair. "Lily, we've been in contact with your father. He's been looking for you. He's been looking everywhere. He's on his way here right now." Lily's face transformed. For the first time, she looked like a normal 7-year-old girl. Her eyes lit up, and a smile broke through the fear and exhaustion. "My dad? He's coming?" "He's coming," the detective confirmed. "He's been sick with worry. He never stopped looking for you." Roderick stood up quietly, gathering his hat. He knew his presence was no longer needed here. This was a moment for family, for the private reunion that would begin the long process of healing. But as he reached the door, Lily's voice stopped him. "Wait." He turned. Lily had slipped off her chair and was standing in the middle of the room, her small hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for seeing me. Nobody else saw me, but you did." Roderick felt something crack inside his chest, in something he had kept carefully sealed for years. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of her. "Lily, I need you to remember something. What happened today? That wasn't about me being special or different from anyone else. It was about you being brave enough to ask for help. You saved yourself. I just happened to be the person who was there when you did." He stood up and left the room before she could see the tears threatening to spill from his own eyes. The police station had quieted down somewhat, but there was still a buzz of activity around the main desk. As Roderick walked through the corridor, officers he had never met nodded at him with respect. One young constable actually stopped and shook his hand. "That was incredible, sir. What you did out there. You saved that little girl's life." Roderick accepted the praise with a nod, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the official report he would have to write, the questions he would have to answer from his commanding officers. He had broken protocol. He had abandoned his post. The fact that he had saved a child might not be enough to protect him from the consequences. His phone buzzed. It was a text from his regimental sergeant major. "Report to the barracks immediately. Command wants a statement." Roderick sighed and headed for the door. Outside the police station, the December afternoon had grown dark and cold. Streetlights were flickering on, casting pools of orange light onto the wet pavement. Roderick walked toward the taxi rank, his mind churning with everything that had happened. He had just done something that would change his life forever. Whether that change would be for good or ill remained to be seen. As he reached for the door of a taxi, his phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from an unknown number. "We know what you did. We're watching." Roderick stared at the message for a long moment, his soldier's instincts suddenly flaring with alarm. He looked around at the dark street, at the shadows between the streetlights, at the few people hurrying home through the cold. Was someone watching him right now? Was the threat not over? He got into the taxi and gave the driver the address of the barracks, but his hand never left the pocket where he kept his military ID and the small folding knife that was standard issue for soldiers. The message could be nothing. A wrong number, a prank. There's someone who had gotten his number from the news reports that would surely follow today's events. But it could also be something else. The man they had arrested might have had friends. The network that had been trying to take Lily might be larger than anyone knew. Roderick stared out the taxi window at the passing London streets and wondered if he had just made himself a target. The barracks was alive with tension when Roderick arrived. Soldiers who would normally nod or wave as he passed barely met his eyes. There was a charged atmosphere in the air, the kind of quiet before a storm that every military man recognized. Something was happening. Something big. He was escorted directly to the office of the commanding officer, Colonel Harrington, a man with 30 years of service and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He sat behind his desk, reading something on a tablet, and didn't look up when Roderick entered and stood at attention. "Staff Sergeant Vale," the colonel said finally, still not looking up. "You had an eventful morning." "Sir." Roderick kept his eyes fixed on the wall behind the colonel's desk. The colonel set down the tablet and finally raised his eyes. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Roderick considered the question carefully. "I believe I saved a child from a potential trafficking situation, sir." The colonel stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, to Roderick's complete shock, the corner of his mouth twitched upward in something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Sit down, Vale. Before you fall down." Roderick sat. He hadn't realized how exhausted he was until his body hit the chair, and the colonel leaned back and folded his hands over his stomach. "I've been in this regiment for 27 years. I've seen guards do all sorts of things they shouldn't have done. Faint in the heat, scratch their noses. Once, a lad actually fell asleep standing up and toppled over like a tree. But I have never, in all my years, seen a guard leave his post to walk into a crowd and intervene in a situation that was none of his business." Roderick braced himself for the reprimand. "Do you know what the news is calling you?" the colonel continued. "They're calling you a hero. It's all over the television, every channel, every news website. The guard who broke protocol to save a little girl. The public is in love with you. The palace is getting calls. The Prime Minister's office has been asking questions. And do you know what the Queen said when she was told about it?" Roderick shook his head. He couldn't speak. "She said that soldier knew his duty. Not his posted duty, his human duty." The colonel's smile finally broke through. "Son, you're not in trouble. You're getting a commendation." Roderick's brain struggled to process this information. "Sir, I left my post. I broke protocol. You broke protocol to save a child from a man who was part of a trafficking ring that has been under investigation by half the police forces in Europe for 3 years, the colonel interrupted. "The man you helped arrest? He's not just some random creep. He's a major player. And thanks to you, he's in custody. Thanks to you, they've already raided 3 locations and rescued 6 more children. 6 more children, Vale. Because you saw a signal that no one else saw. Roderick sat in stunned silence. He had known the man was dangerous, but he hadn't realized the full scope of what he had stumbled into. There's more, the colonel said. The little girl's father is here. He's been waiting for hours. He wants to thank you personally. Before Roderick could respond, the door opened and a man walked in. He was young, maybe early 30s, with dark circles under his eyes and the gaunt, hollow look of someone who hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and stopped in front of Roderick, who had risen to his feet. The man looked at him for a moment, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Then, without warning, he grabbed Roderick in a fierce hug. Roderick stood rigid for a moment, surprised by the embrace, and then slowly relaxed and returned it. "Thank you," the man whispered. "Thank you for my daughter. Thank you for bringing her back to me." When they finally separated, the man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't have words. For 11 days, I thought I would never see her again. I thought she was gone forever. And then I got a call, and they said she was safe, and they said a guard had seen her signal, had walked away from his post to save her. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was too good to be true. But here you are. Here you are. Roderick found his voice. Your daughter is very brave. She's the one who saved herself. She made the signal. She asked for help. I just happened to be the one who saw it. The father shook his head. You saw it. That's the thing. How many people walked past her in the last 11 days? How many people looked at her and saw nothing? But you saw. You paid attention. You cared. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She asked me to give you this. She said it was important. Roderick unfolded the paper. It was a child's drawing, done in crayon on plain white paper. It showed a tall figure in a black hat standing next to a small figure in a red coat. Above them, a yellow sun smiled down. At the bottom, in wobbly 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for seeing me." Roderick folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket, close to his heart. Tell her I'll keep this forever." The father nodded, unable to speak. Later that night, long after the father had returned to his daughter and the barracks had grown quiet, Roderick sat alone in his small quarters, staring at the drawing. His phone buzzed one last time, another text from that unknown number. But this one was different. You saved her. But there are more. Are you ready to help again? Roderick stared at the message for a long time. The trafficking network was larger than anyone had thought. The man he had helped arrest was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, and someone was reaching out to him, offering him a chance to do more. He thought about Lily's face when she had made that signal. He thought about the drawing in his pocket. He thought about all the other children out there who might not have someone who would see them. He typed his response, "I'm ready." 6 months later, the late spring sunshine warmed the lawns of Windsor Castle as tourists milled about, taking photographs and enjoying the perfect weather. Near the main gate, a new guard stood in a sentry box, his face perfectly still, his eyes constantly moving. His name was Private Thomas Cole, and he had been on public duties for only 3 weeks. He was still learning to filter out the constant distractions of the crowd, still training his eyes to see what mattered amid the chaos of hundreds of moving bodies. A woman approached the barrier with a little girl. The girl wore a bright yellow dress and carried an ice cream cone that was melting faster than she could eat it. She was chattering happily about something, pointing at the guards and laughing. An ordinary family scene. Nothing remarkable. Thomas's eyes passed over them and moved on. But behind them, further back in the crowd, a man stood watching. He was not a tourist. His clothes were ordinary, his face was forgettable, but his eyes were fixed on the sentry box with an intensity that would have been alarming to anyone who noticed. He stood there for a long time, watching the young guard, watching the crowd, watching the castle walls. After a while, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the mass of visitors. No one paid him any attention. No one noticed him leave. A few hours later, in a small flat on the other side of London, Roderick Vale sat at a table covered with photographs, maps, and documents. The drawing Lily had given him was framed on the wall above his desk, a constant reminder of why he did what he did. He no longer wore the uniform of the Queen's Guard, and he had left the regiment under circumstances that were still officially classified, his record sealed, his new employer known only to a handful of people in the highest levels of government. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, Windsor, New Guard, name, Cole. He needs training. He needs to know what to look for. Can you help? Roderick smiled. It was the same question they always asked, and he always gave the same answer. He typed his response, "On my way." As he gathered his things and headed for the door, he paused to look at Lily's drawing one more time. The tall figure in the black hat, the small figure in the red coat, the sun smiling down on them both. "Thank you for seeing me," the drawing said. Roderick touched the frame gently, then turned and walked out the door. Somewhere out there, and in the crowds that gathered outside palaces and castles across the country, there were other children who needed to be seen, other Lilies waiting for someone to notice the signals they were too afraid to speak aloud. He had seen one. He would see more. That was his duty now, not the duty written in military protocols or ceremonial regulations, the duty that lived in the space between what the rules demanded and what humanity required, the duty of seeing,